Okay, wipe-on finishes have become popular for two reasons. One, they are the easiest of all finishes to apply, and two, they do more than any other finish to quote-unquote bring out the wood grain. In other words, you get beautiful depth on a wipe-on finish. Now, there's a reason for this. Chemically, wipe-on finishes aren't that much different from their brush-on cousins. You have a resin suspended in a solvent. You put the resin on the wood, or the mixture on the wood. The solvent, or the volatile part of the mixture, evaporates, leaving the resin, or the non-volatile solids, behind. And these react with oxygen, and the molecules form what chemists call a matrix, sort of a tangled little felt web there of hydrocarbons that solidify and create the thing we all know and love as a finish. Chemically, these things are just really watered-down brush-on finishes. A brush-on finish may have 30 to 40% non-volatile solids in it, resins, while these may have as few as 10% volatile or non-volatile stuff. Over 90% is a solvent. Now, the reason for this is very simple. This is why you can wipe them on. As most experienced finishers know, the whole trick to getting, and this is the most important trick, if you don't pay any attention to anything else that I say, pay attention to this. Put on the coats of finish as thin as possible. As thin as possible. You don't glom on the finish, even when you're brushing or spraying. You want them absolutely thin. Here, you have absolutely no choice but to put them on thin because they're watered down. It's mostly solvent or volatile liquid. It goes away, leaving a very thin coat of non-volatile resin solids. So that's why it's easy to apply and hard to mess up. There's less chance of runs, of pooling, of uneven coverage. It just goes on and stays on. The reason why it brings out the wood grain also has to do with the fact that these are thinned down. These are much less viscous than brush-on finishes. If you put a brush-on finish on the wood, it is what is called a building finish. There, it just lays on the top of the wood and builds up, coat after coat after coat. These are penetrating finishes. You put them on, and they will actually penetrate into the wood. Now, you can do a little experiment. In fact, I think we have. Well, this is pretty rank for an experiment. But I'll get another one here off camera. In fact, I'll get a whole bunch of them because we'll need them. These 8 old shop rags. You take a piece of paper, any piece of paper, hold it up to the light, and it'll pass some light through, but not much. You take some oil, any oil. I'm going to take some 10-net weight oil and put a couple drops on the paper and hold it up to the light. And suddenly, you've got light spots where you put the oil. The oil changes the optical properties of the wood fibers. Paper is, after all, wood or cellulose, and it changes the optical property of those fibers and makes them translucent. So it stands to reason that if you apply a finish and get it to penetrate the wood and change the optical properties of more and more of those wood fibers that are near the surface, so that you can actually see down into the wood a little bit, and it's going to, quote unquote, bring out the grain. So this is why these finishes leave such a beautiful surface, is because they penetrate and change the optical properties of what you're looking at. There are two different types of wipe-on finishes that you should be aware of. The first one is called drying oils. And these were the very first wipe-on finishes, and they're the one that you're most likely to run into is boiled linseed oil. Wiping oils are all from some sort of a vegetable origin. 100% tung oil is another wiping oil. Walnut oil, which is often used as a non-toxic finish, that is a wiping oil. These oils dry, but they are not very hard at all. In fact, it may take boiled linseed oil up to 2 years to fully harden, and then it won't be much harder than an old piece of chewing gum. So wiping oils were the first. Then woodworkers started mixing up drying oils. Now, if I were to take, say, 100% tung oil and partially heat it in a retort, an oxygenless atmosphere, so I change the hydrocarbons a little bit, get them to start to polymerize, and then add some dryers to that, or these are heavy dryers or heavy metal salts that help the oil form a matrix. I would have what is called a wiping oil. It's a modified oil that dries quickly, forms a hard surface, and is specially formulated for wiping. This is a wiping oil. In fact, with the exception of the linseed oil, everything I have here is a wiping oil. By the way, if you take tung oil and you turn it into a wiping oil by mixing it with dryers and partially polymerizing it, it becomes called tung-seed oil. Tung-seed oil. It depends on where you want to put the accent. If you see that on a can, you'll know that it is tung oil that has been messed with. So most of what you're going to be working with, though, is a wiping oil. They're formulated to dry. You won't have to worry, as you would with linseed oil and walnut oil, that they'll never dry. Incidentally, just two brief asides of linseed oil because it's useful in wiping on. First of all, get the boiled linseed oil and not the regular linseed oil. Boiled linseed oil is a finish. Ordinary linseed oil is a liniment. It will never dry. Boiled linseed oil has been messed with. It's been heated up. Not boiled, but it's been put in a retort and what is called cracked, and then they add some metal salts to it to help dry it. This stuff you can use for finishing, but you can't drink it, and it wouldn't be a good idea to use it as a liniment either. The other thing I want to tell you about linseed oil is all of these drying oils react with oxygen to form a matrix, and as they do so, they release a little heat, but none so much as linseed oil. I could take a rag, get it pretty well saturated with linseed oil, wring it out, crumple it up, and sit it in the corner, and by the end of this sawdust session, we'd have a fire. Originally, Watco oil was made, this is teak oil, but here's Danish oil. Watco's Danish oil was made with linseed oil. They took it off the market for a couple years when because of a couple fires that happened, and brought it back on with a new formulation that doesn't include any linseed oil, or at least isn't as volatile as the original was. So if you're using linseed oil or any of these, once you're done with your rag, don't crumple it up. Do one of two things. Either lay it out flat over the edge of a metal trash can, okay, so that so the heat is dissipated if there's going to be any heat, or put it in an airtight container like a potato chip can, something that isn't going to let much oxygen in and will extinguish the fire from oxygen starvation as soon as it starts. Okay. Surface preparation. Is it any different for a wiping surface? Yes, it is. slightly. Because these things don't build very fast, you probably want to sand down to a smoother grit than you would ordinarily go. Brush-on finishes, you can stop at 150 to 180 grit. For these, I would go down to 220, maybe even to 320 for very hard woods. The smoother you make the surface, the more deep the finish will appear. Do not fill open grain. If you like to fill walnut and oak when you to get a perfectly flat finish, do not do that for wipe-on finishes. Wood filler is in itself a finishing thing or finishing type chemical, and it will seal the grains so that these cannot penetrate. If you want to fill the grain, I'll discuss that when we actually get to applying the finish. There's a way to do it with the finish itself. Replace or raise the grain with water. Wet the wood, raise the grain, let the water dry, sand it down before you apply these. You'll get a much smoother finish. By raising the grain, you're knocking off the whiskers. You're creating any distortion that might happen to the grain itself when you apply these. It'll look better, believe me. When you are ready to finish, wipe the wood with a tack cloth. If a tack cloth is just a piece of cheesecloth that has a little shellac and a little dissolved paraffin wax added, and it picks up all the little dust particles. Finally, you want to apply the finish within a week's time of when you do the last sanding. Okay? Wood actually case hardens as it sits around. It'll get a rind on it, so to speak, and this will limit the penetration of the finish. Ideally, you should apply the finish the minute you get it sanded. Don't let it sit around. The first two coats of a penetrating finish like this will penetrate. After the first two coats, you actually are back to a building finish that they don't soak in. So the first two coats of this finish are fairly important. First of all, in application, you want to make sure that you use something that's lint-free. Paper towels just won't cut it. You want T-shirts are actually pretty nice. Old T-shirts. This is it's called a staining pad that I bought at the hardware store. These work pretty good, and they're cheap enough to be thrown away, but they can be cleaned and used over and over again. You want to leave, the point is you want to leave something that, one, doesn't leave any lint behind, and two, will act to mop up or wipe off the excess finish after you've applied it. Some craftsmen swear that they should apply the finish with their hands. The warmth of their hands actually helps the finish penetrate. They've got the right idea, but not enough body heat. Warming this finish up from room temperature to 95 or 99 degrees, whatever your hands are, is not going to change the viscosity of this finish over much. If you really want this to penetrate, put the finish for the first coat in a double boiler on an electric plate. No open flames, please. There are volatile solvents in here. Heat it up to about 130, 140 degrees. Measure it with a candy thermometer, and then apply the finish. That will change the viscosity enough to get more penetration. Not really necessary, but if you're after the penetration, you can do that. I've tried it. I've done it especially with burled wood, such as walnut crotch or blistered maple, and it does make a difference in those really elegant grains that you want to bring out. When you apply the finish, flood the surface at first. Make sure the entire surface is wet. Don't worry about drips and runs and all that stuff. You want to let the finish soak in, penetrate it as much as you can for 5 to 10 minutes. Then go back and wipe it off, okay? Wipe everything. Get into the little cracks, pull out all of that stuff. You want to leave the surface wet, but evenly wet. No places where the finish is pooling up in cracks or crevices. You can use the same cloth that you use to apply the finish. You just wring it out and use it like a mop. Get it full, wring it out, and keep going back until the surface is evenly wet. Let it dry thoroughly between coats. Put on the next coat in 8 hours. Better at 24, no more than 48. Finally. Make sure that you cover all the surfaces inside and out. All finishes change the way that wood absorbs and releases moisture. They are semi-permeable. They don't completely prevent the absorption and the release of moisture, but they do slow it down. If you have one side of a panel coated with finish and the other side isn't, obviously that side is going to absorb or release moisture more than the other, and the wood will cup. So at least for the first 2 coats of a wipe-on finish, coat the inside and the outside of the cabinet. Drawers are a special concern. Drawers should be left unfinished. The theory here is that the wood absorbs the odors before your clothes do. I don't know if that's right, but it sounds like a myth. But that's the tradition. Let's see. Some surfaces. Last thing on applying the first couple of finishes. Some surfaces, especially those with open pores, will bleed finish for a couple hours after you've applied it. You'll wipe it off and you'll come back and you'll see shiny spots where the finish is actually bleeding out. Oak does this a lot. I've also seen cherry do it. If that is the case, if you've got a wood and the temperature and humidity is right for this to bleed, don't leave that wood. You're going to have to sit there and babysit the finish for a couple of hours and wipe it at least once an hour. Otherwise, you'll have runs and shiny spots in the finish that you didn't want. Okay. Successive coats. Once you're past the first 2 coats, you should rub out those first 2 coats. Do this gently, using either the black Scotch-Brite or quadruple-aught steel wool. These finishes go on. The coats are less than 1/1000th of an inch thick, much thinner than brush-on finishes. And so you cannot, when you're sanding between coats, you should not have to use all that much pressure. If you do use a lot of pressure, you'll go right through the finish into the wood and you're back to where you started. Anyway, the more coats that you put on, the longer it will last. But remember that these coats are thinner, and so if you want a deep finish, you may have to put on 10, 12 coats of a wipe-on finish versus 3 or 4 of a building finish to achieve the same effect. When you get to the very last coat, it's always a good idea to wait more than 48 hours to do what is called the rub-out. That's the final polishing of the finish. That way the finish is as hard as possible. It's stopped reacting with oxygen, and it's hard enough to polish to a sheen. You can polish it. I would start with rotten stone. I would not go to pumice. That's too coarse. It'll go through at the finish. Rotten stone and a little wax or a little linseed oil, and rub lightly. You can polish this up. If you're using something else to do the polishing, use the lightest grit, the smallest grit that's available to you. You can actually build up a high gloss finish with wiping finishes. They are, after all, the same thing as the brush-on finishes. It just takes more coats and a delicate touch on the rub out. Finally, you can make your own finishes, your own wipe-on finishes, and I frequently do. Before you can go to the store and buy these in these quart cans, the traditional wipe-on finish was a combination of 3 ingredients: a rubbing oil, such as walnut oil or 100% tung oil, linseed oil, a solvent-bearing finish like varnish, something that is oil-soluble, though you don't want to use shellac, which is alcohol-soluble. It has to be oil-soluble, so varnish, polyurethane, and a solvent, mineral spirits, turpentine. The granddaddy of all wiping finishes was linseed oil, varnish, and turpentine, all in equal quantities, 1 to 1 to 1. I make a wiping finish that I like simply because it's not the traditional recipes, but it is more durable. And Rudy Oselnik taught me this. It's the finish that he used on all his lathe turnings. It's a fast finish, lots of gloss, brings out the grain beautifully. He took a cup of tungseed oil, like this Minwax tung oil finish, and added 2 tablespoons of spar urethane or spar varnish. I like the urethane. The spar varnish is getting hard to find. But what happens here is, at that point, you have these fairly soft resins, alkyds they're called, and they look beautiful, but they're not very durable. Here, you have a much tougher resin, phenolic or plastic, and this adds some toughness to these, and you get a much more durable finish. Also, a finish that will build to a high gloss much faster. They are amazingly durable. I have some jigs, like we have somebody coming in here. I have some jigs in my shop that I have coated with that finish that I just described, and the formula, the recipe, if you want it, is on the blackboard. I've used these jigs daily for over 20 years, and the finish shows nowhere except on the corners or where I grab it. It holds up very, very well. Listen, folks, that's it.